Well, welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, Creating Experiences for Neurodivergent Audiences. My name is Erica Wilhite. I'm the Arts, Learning, and Communities Director here at the Oklahoma Arts Council. I'm also the agency's Accessibility Coordinator. Before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping. You can turn on captioning during the Zoom meeting. If you go to the bottom of the screen towards the right and see the word more, it's at the bottom of the screen. There are three dots. Click on that, and then you can choose captioning, and there you can choose your captioning options. Also, so you know, this meeting is being recorded. I will email everyone a link to this recording following the session, as well as any other resources that are shared throughout the session. We've got this session scheduled to be about an hour and a half. We will not take a scheduled break, but feel free to do so when you need to. Also, feel free to leave your video on or off. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, but feel free to type in your questions and your comments throughout the presentation. And our presenters will get to them when they can or at the end of their presentation. We'll keep an eye on that. Okay, so creating experiences for neurodivergent audiences. This is a session that's a part of a learning series here at our agency, focusing on improving accessibility in the arts for people with disabilities. Our session is led by Square Holes, a team of experts in strategy development for programs serving neurodivergent individuals. We have with us today Beth Varner, who is a school psychologist with more than a decade of experience working with nonprofit organizations, and David Turnbull, who is an occupational therapist and autism researcher with nearly 20 years of experience working with autistic people across the lifespan. I'm so glad you are here with us today for this, this important session. I'm going to turn it over to Square Holes.
Thank you so much, Erica. We very much appreciate the introduction. As she mentioned, my name is Beth Varner, and we're going to hop right in. So, a quick overview of what we're going to be going through today for the agenda. We're going to drop a link in the chat where you can download the handouts. So please feel free to hop over and grab a digital version of that at any point. I'll drop one in there, and then I know Scott and Erica will keep you updated throughout the session to make sure everyone has it. So we're going to do quick introduction to ourselves, and then we're going to cover three main kind of foundational topics, and that is neurodiversity, sensory processing, and executive functioning. Some of you folks might be really familiar with these things. It might be newer concepts to some of you. And so we're going to get some kind of foundational shared understanding in order to move forward and use those concepts to talk about creating inclusive spaces. And the structure, when we're thinking about creating inclusive spaces, we're going to think about what can we do prior to the event, during the event, and then after the event. And then we'll have any time for questions, discussion. Like Erica said, please feel free, jump in the chat if you have any questions. We might pause and address it then, or we might hit it at the end. So a quick introduction to me. Like she mentioned, I am a school psychologist. I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. I stayed there through undergrad. And then I moved to Seattle and did a school psychology training program at the University of Washington. I've practiced as a school psychologist in Alaska, Washington, and California. And a few years ago, Dave and myself moved out to Oklahoma City. So we're new-ish to the Oklahoma area and very excited to be involved in supporting local organizations in creating accessible activities for neurodivergent folks. I don't ever do a presentation without bringing a few cute pictures because that makes everyone's day better. This is a picture of our dog, Jessie, when she was a puppy. She was adorable. I also have to drop in a picture of the best moment of my life, which is when Dave and I spent some time in China and got to go to a panda breeding center and meet a young panda. I peaked in that moment and I'm totally comfortable with it because it was amazing. And Jessie's kind of all grown up now, but luckily she's still very cute. So I'm gonna let Dave introduce himself and he'll kind of go over the first part of our session today.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Dave Turnbull. As Erica said, I'm an occupational therapist and I've done autism research. So I completed a PhD at the University of Southern California, where my research focused on the experience of autism in the community and community engagement and feelings of belonging. I started working with autistic adults in group homes in 2004. So this year has been 20 years somehow. Um, and I've worked with people across the lifespan. Um, I've worked in everything from clinics to schools, vocational programs, group homes, as I said. But my favorite area, and I think the area where hopefully we can make a strong impact, is in the community and providing resources to help folks access their community and participate and fully belong. So yeah, we have a picture of a pretty cool moment in my life. I don't know if it's the greatest, but it was cool. We were another trip that we were lucky to take to the Galapagos. This is just getting off of a boat, trying to walk onto an island when there's sea lions everywhere, including blocking the path that we had to walk. I don't know. It was a pretty great moment. Okay, so now we know who we are. We can talk about why we're here a bit. But before we really get started, I do want to talk a bit about the language that we're going to be using. There's a bit of a debate that you'll hear. Some folks prefer what's known as person first language, or you would say a person with autism. That's often used by educators, medical professionals. It's what I was trained to use in my occupational therapy program. And then a lot of folks prefer identity first language, which you would say an autistic person. And this is what you're going to hear me kind of defaulting to throughout this presentation. And that's after years of working with autistic adults and looking at the research, we know that about 90% of autistic adults prefer identity first language. Okay, next. So yeah, as we said, there's like a debate. People will have different preferences, and the rule of thumb, the best practice, follow the lead of everybody that you meet. People have preferences about what they want to be called, and we can respect those preferences, and we should be respecting those preferences. Okay. So now we'll dive a little bit more into this idea of neurodiversity. And I'm sure it's something that, some of you may have heard of, some of you may not be that familiar with. So we want to step back and give a brief overview of some concepts and define some terms so everyone's on the same page. Thinking about just diversity, like diversity is a measurement of the degree of variability of any specific variable. It could be something like height or eye color, could be age, hair length, could be anything, but it's the degree of variability in a given population. So we talk about this in degrees, like we say it's a high amount of diversity, a low amount of diversity. So as an example, we can think about biodiversity, which is maybe a concept that's more familiar to folks. So biodiversity is the total diversity of species that inhabit any given ecosystem. So in a rainforest, as you can see here, the biodiversity is extremely high. There's incredible numbers of different species of plants, different bugs, different birds, just thousands of each of them. But in a desert, like you're still going to find life. You're still going to find bugs and plants, but there's probably going to be fewer species and fewer numbers. But so you would say there's a lot less variety. So there's low diversity in a desert. And if we think about the planet Earth as a whole and humans, in all the different ways that we can measure diversity, human diversity on Earth is virtually infinite. Which one of the ways that we can think about diversity in humans is neurodiversity. And that's the idea that people experience and interact with the world around them in different ways, and that there's not one right way to think, learn, or behave. And in this framework, it's important to think that that it's important that difference is not a deficit. So a couple more definitions, and then we can, start talking about the concepts. So yeah, I'm going to define a couple terms that you'll hear a lot, and I think, we should all know. So neurotypical, neurotypical is when a brain thinks, perceives, and learns, and behaves in ways that are considered the norm in a given population. Neurodivergent is when a brain thinks, perceives, learns, and behaves in ways that are different from the norm or the typical. And then neurodiverse, when we say neurodiverse, we're talking about a group that contains both neurotypical and neurodivergent people. An individual is not neurodiverse. They don't have neurodiversity. They are neurodivergent. So when we talk about neurodivergence or neurodiversity, most of the time people are going to be talking about autism, maybe ADHD, but there's a whole host of diagnoses and conditions that kind of fall under this umbrella. So other things we have here are dyspraxia, which affects movement, smooth movement and coordination. There's specific learning disabilities like dyscalculia, dyslexia, and dysgraphia, Tourette's or other tic disorders. And these are all conditions that you're born with and that will remain with you for life. But there's also acquired neurodivergence. And that's things like a traumatic brain injury or a stroke, dementia, or even PTSD. These are events that change the structure and the wiring of your brain in ways that will impact that thinking and learning and perception. And they're just like the diagnoses above, these are hardwired into your brain. So they're not a choice. This is biology and neurology. So roughly 1 in 5, or about 20% of the population as a whole, is neurodivergent. Like we know the best estimates are about 1 in 33 kids in the US are diagnosed with autism, and about 1 in 11 kids are diagnosed with ADHD. And I say kids in that because that's where the research is. We know those numbers from large studies. But all of these occur across the lifespan and remain across the lifespan. So there's a saying in the world of autism that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So in other words, like no two people are alike. And just because they share a diagnosis or a condition, they're just as different as anyone else, any other two people might be. But despite that, there are some common experiences that we can think about when we think about when we're thinking about accessibility and inclusion. So sensory and executive functioning challenges are as close to universal amongst neurodivergent folks as anything is. And we're going to talk about those in more detail. But it's also important just to be aware that it's a very common experience to have anxiety, to have some form of a language impairment, which could be either expressing or communicating or receiving or kind of understanding and decoding communication that's coming to you. And it's important to note that when I'm saying communication, I'm not just talking about what I'm doing now and speaking. Communication is a whole lot of, it's nonverbal communication, the way we move our body, it's writing, it's typing, It can be a lot of things beyond just speaking. But folks might also struggle with impulsivity, with impulse control. And we see a lot of folks have difficulty with transitions. And we see like society is built for the most common neurotype, for neurotypical folks. And unfortunately, it's often in ways that provide a challenge for neurodivergent people, making that difference difficult. Okay. So I think that just by being here today, we're acknowledging that these things are important and they're important in the arts. But we, look at most arts organizations acknowledge that in their missions or in their codes and their ethics. The Oklahoma Arts Council, who are hosting us today, and we're very thankful for, have in their mission that we're committed to ensuring that the arts are accessible to all Oklahomans. All should be underlined right there, regardless of age, race, class, national origin, physical or mental ability. And the National Endowment for the Arts uses the quote a lot, that not every mind or body will experience art the same way, but every mind and body is entitled to that experience. And I firmly believe that, and I hope that everyone else here does as well. And we'll spend the rest of this time hopefully giving you some tips and some knowledge that can help you make that a reality, make it a little bit more, let everyone in to have the experience. But it's important to understand things like neurodiversity, because we want all people to be engaged and included. Accessibility on its own doesn't guarantee engagement or participation. Accessibility is, the wheelchair ramps, accessible restrooms, those things that let people get in the door. But we want people to go beyond just getting in the door and actually engage and participate. So I was lucky during my PhD work to spend about 7 years working on a variety of research projects with autistic people and their families. And I got to know a lot of families from a wide range of backgrounds. And I said nothing's universal with any group of people, but unfortunately, I think one thing that was universal amongst the families that I talked to is a history of negative and or traumatic experiences in the community. And people are left hesitant and wary of public spaces and activities. People face stigma, or they worry about stigma. They worry about expectations of behavior as they enter a space, and what judgment they may face if they themselves or a member of their family might fall outside of that expected behavior. So there are unpredictable environments, unpredictable sensory environments, unpredictable behaviors. And then just that history of negative experiences can lead to not feeling comfortable or welcome. Yeah. So now we'll get into talking about sensory processing. I'm gonna put my occupational therapy hat back on for a few minutes. I imagine this is sensory friendly. Sensory is something that we've mostly heard about. We see sensory friendly screenings or performances or events or sensory bags, sensory backpacks. But I know that, for a lot of us, we might see those things and not really know what they mean. So we'll spend a few minutes here and hopefully can make it a little more clear for you all. So what is sensory processing? It is the constant process in which receptors in our bodies register sensory input, send that information to the brain, where it's processed and interpreted to produce an automatic chemical, motor, or emotional response. So the process is really kind of illustrated in these pictures. Like if I'm we've probably all done this. I've done it far too many times. But you reach out and grab the handle of a hot cast iron pan. So these tiny little microscopic sensors all through our hand that are going to instantly send an electric signal up my arm, through into my spine, into my brain, and my brain's going to get that and say, "Oh man, that's not good. We need to do something." It's going to automatically send a signal back down the same similar pathway back down the arm, and it'll cause your hand almost reflexively. You'll drop the pot, you'll pull away, and the sensory input and your brain worked together to prevent you from being burned. And since this is pain, it's part of the sense of touch, but the basic principle is going to be the same for our senses. There's an input, a signal is sent to the brain from a receptor in our body. The brain decides on the necessary response, and then it sends a signal back to the body where the response takes place. Each sense is going to have its own unique receptors that send signals on different pathways and to different parts of the brain. But sorry, when they arrive in the brain, typically when these signals arrive in the brain, typically we're going to see that reaction and sending a message back to keep us out of danger, keep us safe, and just let us continue on with our lives. When this happens, it's what we would call an adaptive response. It's right there in the middle of this spectrum, where this is where the response from the brain and the body is appropriate to the input that we've received. So in the case of the hot pan, we got that signal, dropped the pan, we moved our hand away. It might hurt a little bit, but hopefully that signal prevented you from a severe burn. For a lot of folks though, and studies show that this is up to 96% of autistic people and maybe about 20 to 21% of the general population. These response patterns are going to fall outside of that middle range. You might see people who are under responsive or hypo responsive, or people who can be hyper responsive or over responsive. And actually, people can be both. Depending on the stimulus. You might be over responsive to noise and under responsive to touch, or switch those out for any two systems you like. So when someone's brain reaction is under responsive, the sensory receptors are generally going to still be sending that signal to the brain. You're getting a sensory input. It's sending a signal to your brain. Your brain is decoding it and maybe not sending anything back, not sending anything to create a response. So this can be a child who, despite having perfect hearing, doesn't respond when you call their name. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we see reactions that are over the top, that are kind of beyond what's necessary for the input that they're responding to. This can be the kid that you hear about that won't keep his shoes and socks on at school or at the store, or can only be comfortable in really specific clothing. Or like in an adaptive response, think about if you put on a sock. Like when you put on a sock in the morning, the first thing when you put it on, you're going to notice it's there. You feel it. You feel a little squeeze on your ankle, your calf, whatever it is. The signal's sending it to your brain saying, "Oh, hey, that's new. What is that?" But then it realizes, like, it figures out as that sensory input keeps coming and there's no damage happening, that this isn't something we need to worry about. And it will kind of eventually at some point stop sending the signal back to your body saying, like, pay attention to this. So you will stop noticing that your sock is squeezing your leg. Like, it's squeezing just as hard as it did. It's still there, but you don't feel it. So your brain's getting all the information, but it realized that it doesn't need to send the signal back anymore. There's nothing to protect from. A brain that's over responsive to tactile, to touch, might feel that sock pressure every minute of every day. Every minute that they're wearing the sock, they feel it just as strongly as the second that they put it on. And there's a constant signaling going from their brain. It's going up and down all day, taking up pretty valuable energy and valuable resources in your brain. And so it can contribute to feeling overwhelmed. And honestly, it can just be really annoying to feel that all day. So most of us learned back in elementary school, probably, that, or maybe from Sesame Street, that we have 5 senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, and sound. Scientists now would argue we definitely have more than 5. Some say 20 or 21. But today we're just going to talk about a couple of new ones maybe for you, that are very important in the regulation of our bodies and our emotions, and are things that can be helpful tools and helpful things to know about as we think about providing activities or providing places for our whole communities to go. So these two maybe new sensations are vestibular and proprioception. So when we think about vestibular, you think about a time that you're really dizzy. You can think back to like elementary school and seeing who could spin the fastest on a tire swing. And you think about how you felt when you're dizzy. Can you see straight? Can you walk in a straight line? Did you feel in control of your body, or did you really feel in tune and in touch with your body in that moment? Like that's your vestibular system in action, and your brain trying to play catch up with these high levels of alerting sensory input from your vestibular system. And just imagine if your vestibular system was dysregulated, folks end up feeling dizzy, getting vertigo, can impact vision. You can feel disoriented. And it can create a lot of anxiety, and just feelings of being out of control of your body. So proprioception is our sense of an awareness of the position of our body in relation to itself. Sounds kind of confusing, but basically we have receptors throughout our body, in our muscles, in our joints, that send signals to our brain that based on movements and muscle contractions. It's when we can activate them through moving or through deep pressure, joint compression. This is where you see things like weighted blankets or heavy work, basically just carrying heavy things, engaging your big core muscles. It can give you a lot of proprioceptive input. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. But so as we get this input, it lets us know where we are. It lets us know where our body is in space, where it is in relation to itself, and we can have a sense of control and comfort of our body. It's necessary for motor planning and coordination, and for maintaining the automatic nature of movement. So you can see in the picture here, there's someone walking on a rough path. And as we do that, generally, I think we're not walking down the path saying like, oh, my ankle is tilted to the left 20 degrees. And when I take my next step, I need to move it back. Like, these are all things that happen automatically. And that's proprioception. That's the sense through our body that lets us just have these automatic processes. And having that right amount of proprioceptive input is really crucial in regulating our bodies, and as a result of regulating our emotions. So for a lot of people with sensory challenges, when they're dysregulated or out of sync with their sensory system or their body, giving them proprioceptive input, which is where those things like weighted blankets can come into play. Getting that proprioceptive input can be really calming and let folks feel in touch with their bodies again and organize their thoughts. So yeah, you see the weighted blankets, or you might see things like alternative kind of seating options. People sit on exercise balls and bounce, or they sit on, they're called wiggle seats. This is a small inflatable disc that people can sit on. And when you sit on those things, you engage your core, you use your core muscles, and you get a lot of proprioceptive feedback. So next we're going to talk a little bit about like what happens when your sensory system is dysregulated. And one thing that can happen is sensory overload. Sensory overload can happen from getting too much sensory input at one time or too much over time. One model that we use in the world of autism to talk about this is this sensory stress bucket. Each of us have our own buckets, and it's shaped by our neurotype and our life experiences. As we move through our lives, we accumulate more water in the bucket in the form of stressors. In this image, we can see the sensory stressors dripping into the bucket, and the water coming ever closer to the top to overflowing. And our buckets, generally speaking, aren't starting the day empty. Like, as I said, we each bring our own experiences. So trauma, medical conditions, economic insecurity, and any number of other stressors can ensure really that for the most of us, we're not going to start the day with that bucket empty. And as that water reaches the top of the bucket, it has to come out. So it can either spill out over the top, which is labeled here. We see meltdown. This can be either a breakdown and a meltdown or the shutdown of the body. So hopefully, ideally, we want to release the water slowly in a controlled way. I guess it doesn't need to be slowly, but in a more controlled way through our little coping outlet at the bottom of the bucket. So that's where we can provide strategies to deal with sensory input. It might be through taking a break in a safe, calm, quiet space, spending time with a safe person, a safe or comfort item, or it could be receiving calming sensory input, or things like you see fidget toys. Sometimes just getting the chance just to engage with that can provide a great outlet for folks. But our goal is to help people find and feel comfortable using the outlets that they have, so we can avoid reaching that meltdown level. And so we can avoid sensory overload. Sensory overload can happen when a person's just simply overwhelmed by the amount or the intensity of sensory input that they're processing. It's a physiological response. This is a physical, chemical, unconscious reaction in your brain and in your body. So this isn't a choice. This isn't a tantrum. These are automatic, unconscious processes. And you can see increased heart rate, increased breathing, sweating, anxiety, panic, agitation, all the things you might see in a panic attack. This is the body that activating its fight or flight response. And it can lead to that breakdown, or it can lead to a shutdown. The shutdown is just what it sounds like. The person shuts down, unable to process and react to new incoming input effectively. So when we think about how to support folks with sensory challenges, there are two kind of somewhat complementary approaches. First, we can look at creating programs and events that are specific for this community. That's where you see things like sensory-friendly events, sensory-friendly screenings, relaxed performances in theaters. Or the other option, and it's not an either or, you can do both, but the second is providing resources to give participants choice and control over their sensory experiences in your typical spaces and at your typical events. So this can be things like offering sensory bags with headphones or sunglasses that allow folks to control their own input, their own sensory input, or offering resources like social narratives and sensory maps that give people an idea of what they can expect when they are in your space or at your event, and it gives them choice in how they want to engage with that. And when we think about the typical environments in live events or workshops, I think we can see why we might want to provide accommodations for folks with sensory challenges. Like you can expect to see cramped, crowded spaces, sounds coming from different directions, different simultaneous sounds, bright lights, flashing lights, or fluorescent lights. Some folks may not feel comfortable in the dark, or it could be too hot, it could be too cold, it could be too stuffy. And each of these things can stack up on one another and keep adding water to that sensory stress bucket that we talked about. And as these things stack up, it can become more difficult for people to process new sensory information that they're receiving, like verbal instructions that you might be giving them, or conversations that they might need to have to participate in the activity that you have for them.
All right. So the last area that we're going to talk about for kind of this foundation concept setting is executive functioning. And executive function is another thing that will definitely impact the participation of folks in your classes, in your art groups, in your live events. Oftentimes we only talk about sensory. Sometimes you hear people really focus on the sensory angle of things, but another one that really matters is executive function. So generally it's thought that executive function lives in your prefrontal cortex, so the front of your brain here, which is also the last part of your brain to fully develop. So, in a typically developing individual, this isn't in place until your early 20s. In folks with developmental delays, it might be much later. So, this is a skill and an ability that your brain continues to grow for quite a long time past other skills that we see coming up earlier in childhood or things like that. The thing that's really cool to know about is that executive functioning is something that can both be taught and can be accommodated. So we can provide supports for folks that have difficulty with executive function. So, and those might be appropriate, kind of the angle to think about how we can accommodate folks in if you're here and have any theater, dance, other live performance type things. You're not necessarily in the business of teaching folks executive functioning skills, but you can accommodate for them in your environment. On the other hand, those of you that are school-based or have art classes, art workshops, other things, there might be ways to think about building support for executive function skills in your teaching environment. So a few key components of executive function include one is working memory. So that's the ability to retain and manipulate distinct pieces of information over a short period of time. And it's also so it's keeping that information and then being able to do something with it. So if I said, I'm going to tell you a string of numbers and letters, and then I want you to give me back the letters in alphabetical order and then the numbers in numerical order. And then I said W, 5, T, D, 8, 2. Some of you will be able to take those 6 digits that I just gave you and rearrange them into alphabetical order and then numerical order. And some of your brains might have gone, zap, I don't, what, huh? I'm not, no. And that really is, we have a whole spectrum of working memory and ability that is a high level, more difficult item when measuring an individual's working memory. Another skill is mental flexibility. So our ability to sustain and shift attention in response to different demands. Also our kind of code switching ability, applying different rules to different settings is here, being able to go with the flow, seeing things from multiple points of view. Self-control is another executive function, helping us set our priorities and resist impulsive actions or things we might be drawn to do, even if it conflicts with our priorities. Emotion regulation is a big part of executive function. That's our ability to tolerate, understand, manage our feelings in a way that's healthy and productive, as well as just general organizing, planning, prioritizing, getting a data set, figuring out the most relevant information, filtering out the parts aren't important, and then making a plan. So any sort of multi-step process, taking on a big project, breaking it down into pieces, all of that has very large executive function demands. And so we can already start imagining, if we're wanting to support folks in our environment that have executive functioning deficits, well, how can we make things more clear, provide step-by-step supports, etc.? I'm kind of getting ahead of the adaptations part, but think about that kind of as we're going through. So I'm not going to read all of these to you. You can look through it in your handouts, but you can really see some kind of characteristic uh, experiences of folks with executive function deficits. So we can see being very distractible, having trouble focusing on just one thing, alternately focusing too much on just one thing. Maybe an individual walks in the door to your museum and says, these are the 3 exhibits that I want to see today before I leave. And it's really important to me that I see all 3. But then they go into the first one and they're there until they get the overhead announcement. The museum's closing in 20 minutes. And oh my gosh, how frustrating, because now I don't get to do all the things I wanted to do today because time just got away from me. That is a very common experience for folks that struggle with executive function. Struggling to kind of transition from one task to another. An example that I love of how executive function could slip for any of us is an example of winding up and finding your keys in the refrigerator, because then you step back and you're like, why are my keys in the refrigerator? And it's like, oh, well, I wanted a snack, but both my hands were full. So I dropped my keys to pick up whatever it was. And then I already forgot that they were there and I shut the door like that. That's a reasonable thing that could happen to almost any of us. And that's an exact example of your executive function losing track of some of the details. So when we think about supporting executive function demands for visitors and participants in our events, we think about making activities adaptable. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but we really want to think about how we can have adaptable things that we're doing. Let's say we're talking about we're in like an art class or we're in some sort of kind of group workshop setting. What I want to set up is a scenario in which I can meet the executive function needs of a variety of different students in my classroom. So, or participants in my art group. And the just right fit is one that challenges you enough so that you're not bored, but doesn't overwhelm you with challenge. So maybe I have some folks with really strong executive function skills. And for those individuals, I say, this is the project today. Go find the materials that you need. And they go get it and come back together. Maybe for other folks, I have little printed lists of these are the materials that you're going to need for our activity today. And I hand it to them and then they can go and collect their own things. For other folks, I might have a station set up with all of their materials already there. for them to have what they need to go ahead and get going. So that's a really easy way that I can make something that we're all doing as a group adaptable to the level of anyone that's participating. Another important way of supporting executive function challenges, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in a moment, is offering pre-visit resources. We call it the pre-visit toolkit. It's having things available on your website in the information about your events, about your theater, about whatever it might be, to make it so that folks can prepare themselves. And some of you might do that. This is something that I do. Before I go to a new environment that tends to cause me stress, like maybe a doctor's visit or a dentist visit, I tend to hop onto Google Maps, go to Yelp, something like that, and I want to click through the images of what it looks like in the lobby. Because when I, or whatever pictures they have in there, because when I have kind of a mental schema for, okay, I know what I'm walking into, when I actually walk into that room, it doesn't take as much of the cognitive load to be like, yep, okay, I'm in this room. Whereas if I have no idea what I'm walking into, it can be a little bit like, okay, now I have to kind of adapt. Is there anything I need to notice about this room? And then move on. And we can do that exactly for all of our live events, whether we have more audience-based, observant audiences, or whether we have participation-based events and activities that we're doing. If we give folks the tools to engage and know what it is beforehand, it's going to reduce the executive functioning demands of them just walking in the door to your event or activity. Clear, consistent maps, signage, staff designation. When you're in this building, anyone with a blue lanyard is someone that you can ask for help. Very clear signs about where folks need to go. If I don't need to stand in your lobby and kind of look around to figure out where the bathroom is, again, that's going to reduce the executive function load that I need to engage in your space. And it's important to know that each of the communities that y'all serve are unique, and the expertise about what is needed in that community exists within that community. So a really important part of doing all of this, but definitely including supporting executive function challenges, is collaborating with your community, finding neurodivergent staff, community members, other folks in your community that are willing to give you feedback about how things are going, what was helpful. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Okay, so let's get into the meat here. We've given you the foundation of the neurodiversity framework and some vocabulary that you can use. We've talked a little bit about sensory processing, what it is, how it can impact your body and your brain if your sensory systems are overloaded or out of whack. And we've talked about executive function as another potential cause for frustration and another system of the body that the live events and activities that we're producing and want people to come participate in, their executive functioning system can be really taxed by those things. So how are we being supportive? How do we support things? Let's talk for a minute about audiences. So I'm thinking about observational audiences. They come in to your theater to view a live performance of some kind, a ballet, a concert, theater production, dance, you name it. A first step that we can do is just rethinking what is expected in this space. So while we might traditionally expect things like being quiet, sitting still, staying in your seat for the whole activity, using applause and laughter to indicate your engagement with what's going on stage, keeping electronic devices in your pockets, etc. A sensory inclusive experience, an audience that can kind of dive in and experience it the way that they want to, might be given the freedom to be noisy, to sit, stand, jump, dance, whatever it might be, come in and out. It might be the engagement might be difficult for the performers who are used to maybe a neurotypical audience, or at least people conforming to the behavior expectations of a neurotypical audience. it might require a little bit of brain rewiring to say, oh yeah, if someone shouts back at me, it isn't them heckling me, it's them being engaged and involved. Um, Freedom to use electronic devices, etc. So in settings like we're talking about, where it's dance, ballet, etc., Dave pointed out those two kind of options that you can do. One is provide kind of separate times for folks for a sensory inclusive experience, or provide supports in your normal environment. And we generally find folks doing live events with observational audiences to prefer kind of a separate time where these audience expectations can be relaxed without disturbing the experience of folks that do prefer the more traditional audience expectations. So that's where we see folks doing things like sensory friendly, or more and more they're called relaxed performances. And they provide a more gradual transition between sensory environments, maybe the lights in the lobby to the lights in the entryway to the house. The house lights on in the house is more of a gradual transition instead of just stepping into the dark or stepping into the light. In these performances, you might avoid strobe lights, flashing lights, sudden or loud noises. You might make sure that the aisles are particularly clear, that folks can come in and out. A lot of folks that do these relaxed performances just leave the doors at the back of the house open so that folks can kind of come and go. And so this provides a setting where those kind of alternative behavior expectations become the norm. We see a lot of movie theaters doing this now for certain specific sensory experiences. And like Dave said, the maybe the most common experience from folks that are neurodivergent and their families is feeling like there is not a place for them in their community. And if we're providing opportunities that are literally, this is the place, and we welcome you, this is made exactly for you, how much better can we get with engagement and really making people come in and feel welcome? A lot of dance and theater performers will offer maybe their dress or some of their final dress, final rehearsals, whatever it might be, as relaxed performances. And some folks just build it into their normal during the performance schedule. So now let's think about this same thing for more of the art class, individual art instruction, maybe a group at some sort of group facility, or other opportunities where we can, again, think about the difference between what we expect from participants typically and how we might adjust some of those. So if we have a classroom, or a art learning activity, particularly if we have older participants, like anyone that's a young adult or older, we might have some actually fairly specific kind of expectations with regards to what participation might look like. We might expect folks to be quiet or sitting still, again, participating for the whole activity, using eye contact, facial expressions, and following along with the activity to indicate that they're participating, keeping all their electronic devices put away. We don't necessarily expect all of this from children, right? Those of you that are arts educators for young children, you don't expect this. So you're already kind of used to providing some flexibility. But could we provide that in different ways and for different age groups across the lifespan? So when we're thinking about sensory inclusive classes, labs, we can think about at least having some time dedicated for open talking, making noise. It's still appropriate to say, this is a quiet time and this is not, but thinking about making sure that everyone has the ability to express what they need, and also not making the class expectations so stringent that folks can't express themselves freely. Having some flexible workstation options, we already kind of talked about that. Like, do you have a dedicated space where you have all your materials? Do you need to sit? Do you need to stand? Do you need to be on a wiggle seat? You need to do whatever that looks like. Maybe you allow for participation in only parts of the class. And don't assume that if someone is maybe doing something a little different than you expected, that they're not engaged with the course and what you're doing. And, the availability of electronic devices as safety allows in these settings. So how do we know what exactly I need to do to provide the most inclusive experience for my audience, for my participants? Well, we like to use this framework for providing our audience members and participants with as much preparation, choice, and control as possible. If we're doing these three things, we're providing resources for individuals to then make their own experience. So preparation lets visitors know what to expect, what they're walking into, and it allows them to plan ahead because I'm providing them enough information to do so. Choice lets visitors experience your museum, your theater, your art class, whatever it might be, in the way that works best for them individually. And control lets visitors control their own sensory experience. So that can be allowing folks to wear headphones, sunglasses, providing opportunities. Maybe some theater and other live performances will have kind of like a calm room or something like that in the back where folks can go in, have a smaller space, but still hear the performance, the show. So let's kind of break down how we can provide preparation, choice, and control throughout the audience experience. And what's really important to know is that this begins well before anyone walks in the door. We know that anxiety, Dave mentioned that on the list, as a common experience for neurodivergent folks. And when we're providing tools for preparation, we're literally helping them get that little release valve out the bottom of the bucket and reduce the sensory and executive functioning demands of the experience that they have. So we want to make sure for your events, for your classes, that resources are available on your website that support folks with to engage with the material as much as they want in advance to feel prepared to enter your space. Some participants like for example, when I go to the theater, I prefer to not always know what the story is about. I don't read it in advance because I don't want to know. That said, my mom lives in Southern Oregon, so I've gone to the Shakespeare Festival with her down there, and I'll be honest, it's been a minute since I was literate in Shakespeare, and so I often will read a plot summary in advance or maybe at the intermission just to make sure that I kind of have the ballpark of what's going on, and it allows me to enjoy the experience. And what's great is that I have the choice to decide how much I want to do that and how much I don't. So having resources available on your website for your classes or your performance spaces that include maps, schedules, guides, photos, and descriptions of the physical space. Social narratives are a way to kind of create a bit of a story for I'm going to go to this space and this is what I'm going to see and this is what I'm going to hear. Some folks offer, for example, sensory guides for while you're in different spaces in this activity that you're participating in. You might, this particular area might have high degrees of sound or a strong smell. Maybe in our class today, we're going to be working with paint that has a very strong smell. And I want to know that before I walk in the room so that I'm prepared to handle it, or I'm prepared to choose, oh, I don't think art class is a good choice for me today. When we think about visual schedules, it's allowing folks to see visually, this is how we're going to spend our time today. This is particularly important in that kind of class or workshop activity. Providing set lists for concerts, plot guides for theater, like I mentioned, having kind of video walkthroughs of your space. So when I, can go to your website or to YouTube and see movement through the space and what it looks like, again, it lowers the executive functioning demands when I'm in that space, because even if I haven't been there before, my brain recognizes it at least a little bit. It's also important to think about okay, now we're in the building, but we haven't started yet, or we're kind of transitioning to starting. And we're thinking about how our audience members or our class participants can be prepared for upcoming events, transitions. A common way of doing this is allowing early entry to go into the space and find or select your seat. So if I'm going to a class and maybe let's say that I'm hosting like a class, a workshop for learning how to do some sort of art. Maybe I say on my website, if you'd like to come see the space in advance, like set up an appointment with me. And that way you can come in, see it, look around. Maybe if you have a request, like, oh, could you save that seat for me? Great. Some live performance venues will do like a meet your seat activity where you get to go in, see where you're sitting, and orient yourself to that before it gets all chaotic. I don't know how many of us do that, but I know Dave and I tend to do that when we go to live performances. We like to go see where our seats are and then, go hit the bathroom and take a break. It's just good to orient yourself in the space, and providing that as an explicit option will support more folks in accessing our activities. Some theaters or other performance venues will invite audience members to like a pre-show meet and greet, particularly before these like relaxed performances that are targeted towards neurodivergent folks. If there's characters or props that might seem frightening or scary, having the opportunity to meet the actor, see the thing in advance, and it can help folks who might not be able to do the perspective taking to understand that it's not real. It can help reinforce that. It's also a really good option to kind of telling visitors before any schedules events, schedule changes, loud noises, flashing lights, really letting folks in your classes tour the space, meet the instructors. I've worked in the schools for a long time, and there's always a, new freshman early day where all the poor little eighth graders that are getting ready to head to high school get to go just see the building, see what's going on. Think about offering opportunities like that in your space. So during the event, this is a space where we can really think about choice. We can provide printed materials that allow independent navigation of the space and the activities that are available. So as much as folks are allowed to kind of move through the space and do things, you can provide resources that indicate that that's okay. That's a clear thing, it's an acceptable thing to do. So again, we can provide maps, schedules, set lists, plot guides that highlight any bright noises, flashing lights. We can make sure that materials in our class environment are clearly labeled, they're accessible. When possible, we can provide both seating and standing and wiggling and alternative seating options. It should be really important and very clear to visitors where they are, where they can go, and who can help them. That's what's important, having adequate signage, making our folks, our staff, volunteers, et cetera, easily identifiable. And one thing that I think is really important when you're thinking about a class or a workshop environment is allowing flexibility in the cues that you're going to use to request help. You might have neurodivergent folks that come into your space that really want to engage, but things like raising their hand and asking a question, catching your eye as you walk across the room and saying, "Oh, I have a question," maybe that feels difficult or overwhelming or impossible. And so think about different ways. Can you say in advance to an individual or to the whole class, if you need my help, I'm going to be looking the room for raised hands. I'm going to be looking for people that have whatever, a cup or an object turned upside down in front of them. What's a way that you can have a universal cue for the whole room, or for individuals who need it, that then if they do that thing, it's like those Brazilian stakeout places where you turn the cue on your table, you're indicating, hey, I would like some help, I'd like some support in this activity, but you don't have to do it in the way that we might typically expect. Dave, did you want to talk about these examples really quick?
Sure, I can. We have this picture here. The picture on the screen is a set list from uh, a band called Public Broadcasting Corporation. I think they're a British band. I don't know much about them. This is something I found on social media, so I can't vouch for the quality of the band. But this was something that fans on a tour requested that they offer, asked what they can do to help neurodivergent fans. So they started giving out at the beginning of shows to people who wanted them. They gave out their set list, and they went above that to mark on each of these songs. You can see like um, on the song "All Out," it's marked as very loud and stroby. So you're giving people advance warning, like when we get to this point, the strobe lights are going to come on. It's going to be loud. So if you want to accommodate, if you want to wear headphones, if you need to put on sunglasses, if you need to leave the room, those are all your choice. And also another thing that another way that even just a set list can support folks is, say I'm going to the Public Broadcasting Corporation concert and my favorite song ever is, let's see, Blue Heaven. Um, I might just obsess, just not be able to think about anything else but when are they going to play Blue Heaven? Is Blue Heaven going to come up tonight? Am I going to get to hear it? Like, so I'm not even able to just enjoy the first however 8, 10 songs, whatever it is, as I'm thinking the whole time, like, oh, this isn't Blue Heaven. Maybe Blue Heaven's next. But if I have this set list, I can look at it before the show starts and say, like, oh yeah, it's there, it's coming. I'm gonna get to hear it. This is amazing, and I can enjoy everything that happens before it a little bit more. Um, this is just a photo from the San Diego Zoo. This is right where you buy tickets and come in the gate. They have a big sign right there that says sensory bags are available here. A lot of folks have sensory bags and sensory accommodations that don't get used as much as maybe they would if folks knew that they were available. And as long if you have these things, but people don't know how to access them, you might as well not have them. So people need to know how to access the supports that you're offering. So making it clear, this is right up front. Everybody's going to see this sign, and everybody's going to feel welcome asking for it.
So we have some other kind of ways that we can support during the event, right? So as much as possible, we want individuals to be able to control their own engagement with what you're doing and their sensory experience. So this can look really different for different settings. And I know we have a broad group of folks here today with regards to kind of what you're doing in your spaces. But thinking about if the activities that you're offering allow for it, can you have a sensory break space, a place where folks can go and kind of have a bit of time away? This is a picture of the sensory room at the Ralph Wilson Children's Museum in Buffalo. Yesterday, we were actually at the Science Museum, Oklahoma, to see their sensory space, and it was incredible. I wanted to spend all day there. If you're ever looking for a cool example of a sensory space, check out the Science Museum. Um, you can also provide sensory kits like Dave was just referring to, having resources available so that people don't always have to bring their own fidget toys or their own headphones or sunglasses, or maybe you forgot them at home or whatever it might be. Have some things available that can be borrowed. Um, I was talking to someone yesterday and they had a good tip, which was also making all the objects that you put in your sensory bags maybe available for purchase from your gift shop in case anyone gets very attached to one of them and wants to bring it home with them. Having alternative seating options. What can you sit on in this space? The gray thing at the bottom of the screen there is one of those wiggle seats. It's a slightly inflated circle that works similar to a exercise ball in the way that it makes you engage your core, get that proprioceptive input, as well as these other kind of weird shape exercise ball. And then the blue seat there is another, it's a little rounded on the bottom. So it gives you some good input. Is there space for weighted blankets, stuffed animals, alternative activities? So in this class space, for example, we are all doing tie-dye today, and that's the group activity that we're going to do. But you know that in my class, in my art course, in whatever it might be, and I'm not talking about just kids here, I'm talking about people of all ages, there is always a dedicated drawing or collage or some low supervision required activity that is always set up at this table. And we want you to come to art class, and we want you to be here with us, in community with us. And if tie-dye feels not okay, if it feels kind of intense, if it feels like you're going to turn your fingers blue and you don't really want to do that, come to art class and hang out on the drawing table, because we're just happy that you're here. So having alternative activities in your space can be really important. Also avoiding unexpected sensory input. So sometimes that means changing the input, right? So we talked about in a relaxed performance, for example, you might reduce or eliminate things like flashing lights, sudden loud noises, etc. Alternately, you might just find ways to prepare visitors for that alerting sensory input. Like, for example, the set list that Dave showed. Or David, do you want to talk about this other cool resource that you saw?
Yeah, this is one thing that I've seen at a few the relaxed performances in theaters, where to prepare people for upcoming, you can't always eliminate every bright light, flashing light, loud noise, but we can still help prepare folks. And you might set up a code that, maybe if there's going to be a loud noise, if there's going to be a gunshot on stage, if there's going to, whatever it is, a quick sudden noise, a loud bang of some sort, someone 30 seconds before that noise standing in the front can hold up a green glow stick, and people can see that green glow stick and say, like, time to put on my headphones, or time to take a bathroom break for a minute. And you can have different colors for different, you can have bright lights, whatever it is, you can create a code. And again, it's about communicating what that code means, providing people resources that they can understand what the communication is. But yeah, even something that simple, just in the moment preparing someone, can have a huge impact.
So then we also kind of, we talked about before, we talked about during. Now let's kind of close some of this time together with, let's talk about after. How do we make sure that what we're doing is working? How do we make sure that what we're doing is worth the time and the effort that we're spending to do it? And an important piece of that is soliciting feedback from our communities. So that could be something formal, like an audience or participant survey, asking for feedback on accommodations that you're already providing, or maybe saying, hey, we're thinking about doing a sensory friendly performance, or we're thinking about offering one art class per week that has slightly different kind of behavior expectations in the group. Like, tell me what your ideas are. You can kind of send that out to your audience and see what kind of feedback you have. We can also solicit feedback in an informal way. Have it be part of your staff procedure, where maybe the person at the front who's responsible for checking out the sensory bags that people might use in your space, the procedure then is when folks come and return them, they say, like, hey, how did it go? Or is there anything you wish we had in there? Or what can we do better next time? Just like a light question that if someone responds with, no, it was great, thank you, end the conversation, that's fine, no pressure. But if someone says, oh man, I would really wish there were sunglasses in here today, I forgot my sunglasses at home and it helps me with bright lights, that person needs to write it down. And then you have feedback just right there in the moment. Another way you can get feedback is organizing community work groups. And it's really important in these environments to include participants with lived experience. We want neurodivergent folks, other folks with disabilities, to be in our groups, providing us direct feedback on the accessibility, on our accessibility efforts and their efficacy. Similar to Dave saying, if you have sensory bags or other resources, but no one's using them, you may as well not have them. If you're gathering feedback and aren't doing anything with it, you may as well just not ask the question. So what's really important is having a plan to implement that feedback in order to iterate, in order to improve what you're offering. And that can require some mental flexibility because you might do a ton of research and think that you have come up with the best sensory kits ever made to man. And this is the best thing. And I'm going to change the lives of all of my participants. And you might be right. And you also might get a few suggestions of, it was a little too heavy, or I wish it included this, or whatever. Be willing to try new things, be willing to adjust midstream. And always we're trying to strive to get closer and closer and closer to being more inclusive, more accessible. Accessibility is not a destination, it is a process that we're constantly on. So how do we make sure that we're using the feedback that we're getting? Well, we need to keep data about our accessibility efforts. And this is something that we can do in both kind of a quantitative way and a qualitative way, because we know sometimes our funders, our grantors, they want more quantitative type information from us. Also, we, sometimes can give those numbers flavor by having some good qualitative data. So if you have a resource that you can track engagement with, you may as well. How many sensory kits do you check out every day? That would be a fairly easy piece of data to get your staff in the routine of keeping. And then it's going to allow you to measure the impact of different things. If you just start having folks make a tick mark in a box every single time someone checks out a sensory bag, and then a month later you put up signs like they have at the San Diego Zoo that say sensory bags are available here, and you keep doing that, you're going to have some really clear data that will probably be a pretty good indicator of the impact of those signs. And so little things like that, make note of when you're offering new options, new resources. Work with your colleagues, talk to your marketing team, talk to your education team to promote accessibility efforts. Can we spiff up the accessibility page on the website and make a more robust pre-visit toolkit? Can we make sure that there is a blurb in our upcoming newsletter about just a reminder, this, art class welcomes all types of folks. Just a reminder, our dance performance every, Thursday morning has a sensory friendly audience option. Making sure that you're pushing it out into the community. And then we know, everyone in nonprofit world knows that if we don't create some structure for organizational accountability, our best laid plans get left on the wayside. And so making sure that your accessibility efforts and the improvements that you're making to that process are built into your strategic planning and are built into the regularly scheduled reviews and evaluations that you're doing with your facility, with the offerings that you have. Make sure that your accessibility plan is sustainable beyond your individual involvement. I did a nonprofit, a master's in nonprofit management coursework, and I had this really great professor who he would say, we always kind of have this colloquialism of like, what's going to happen if you get hit by a bus? And he was like, no, I don't like that. That's too negative. Let's not put that out into the world. He would always say, what happens if you win the lottery? If you win the lottery tomorrow and you decide that you're going to go, whatever, live on a beach for the next year, could what you're doing, could your accessibility efforts continue beyond you? And I know we think a lot about sustainability in nonprofit, in education, in these areas that we're in, but I just want to underscore that. Make sure that the plan is something that could continue regardless of your own individual involvement, and make sure that every single plan has the planning process includes folks with lived experience, and make sure that this organizational process that you're setting up for accessibility at its core, at its foundation, includes folks with lived experience. So we talked about preparation, choice, and control. We talked about how we can offer these things before, during, and after our live event, our activity, whatever it might be. And here's the cool thing about those. If you offer your audience or your participants as much preparation, choice, and control as possible, you're allowing your guests to craft their own experience. that means you don't have to be the expert on what every single individual that walks into your theater space or walks into your classroom needs in order to be successful there. Obviously, we want to do what we can to be as accessible to as many people as possible. And the way we do that is by providing a wide swath of options and allowing folks to say, what you want your experience to be in this space, you can be in control of that. And I can support you and help you along the way. It means that you don't have to be the expert. And that can really take some pressure off someone trying to implement these plans and feeling overwhelmed by all the potential opportunities. And at the end of the day, when you don't know, exactly the same as at the very beginning, where we talked about identity first language and person first language, follow the lead of the person that you're talking to. When in doubt, just ask questions. How can I support you? What do you need? Which would you prefer? Now, this doesn't mean training your front desk staff to like scan people coming in and try and see who might be disabled and asking them a bunch of questions. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, how can we just build in to the way we interact with all of our patrons and participants? Hey, how can I help you? Is there anything you need today? Broad questions that kind of bring up the option, and then also having clear signage so that folks know, okay, that's the help desk. It's very clear there. If I don't know where to go or where my classroom is or whatever it might be, I'm going to go to that spot. And I saw on their website that there's a help desk in the lobby, and then everyone that's wearing a blue lanyard is someone I can ask for help. The most important element for having a truly inclusive experience in your space is positive and welcoming interactions with staff and volunteers. And if you can structure that into folks' times in your space and in your activities, you are really setting yourself and them up for success and making the most inclusive environment that you possibly can. So we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone has any questions, any further discussion, feel free to drop something in the chat or unmute yourself and we can chat about however else we can support you. I'm going to drop the handout link in the chat again. And then I'm also going to put up, so Dave and I are, like we said at the beginning, our company is called Square Holes. We're providing consulting and support. And if you would like to sign up for some email updates and learn more about us, you can visit our website or hit this QR code and it will take you to a email sign up list.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, please.
When you have a neurodiverse classroom,
Yeah.
like this is an example that I get almost on a daily basis, because we have a really neurodiverse classroom on a daily basis. We have one student who wants to ask a lot of questions. I have no problem with that, of them, just blurting out a question. I think it's awesome that they want to be so engaged and have a dialogue like that. But there are other students in the classroom that, they want to start moving forward with the project and they feel like they're being held back. What do you suggest is the best way to move forward for both parties in a situation like that?
Yeah, so I think it's about providing as many options as possible, right? So if you say, kind of like we did today, setting up expectations for, is it okay to ask questions now or is it not? Being very clear about, if so, how are you going to do it? And then kind of structuring, okay, I'm going to do the introduction of the activity that we're doing today and the expectations, where the materials are, et cetera. And then at the end of that time, I'm going to have, if you want to sit and work at your desk and get going, or wherever you're working, go for it. And if you want to chat more about questions and details and whatever, we're going to do it in this spot of the room or something like that. And some folks also benefit because sometimes you get those like, and there's just more questions and more questions and more questions. Maybe putting a time limit on that or some sort of, here's for the next 5 minutes, I'm going to stand right here. And if you want to talk more, you can do that. And so if you're frequent questioner wants to come over to you and do that, You might also find that there's a couple folks that like don't want to ask questions, but really want to hear the questions and the continuing dialogue, making kind of a space for them to have that, but not making everyone else wait, right? For that to be over before they can get to work. That's one idea. Or like, you know, or maybe you have the exchange in front of the class, but don't stop other folks from starting to work or starting their activity before that back and forth question is.
It's also something that potentially, like having schedules, like a visual schedule, or providing advance notice of transitions to prepare people. Like you might have something. I have this little guy here. It's called the time timer. Great name. But you can set a timer on it, and it shows you visually. I don't know if anyone can even see that in the glare, but it shows you visually how much time is remaining. So you say we're doing 10 minutes on this topic, and then we're gonna move on to, I don't know, whatever it is. Like you have this, you say we're gonna 10 minutes drawing, and then after that we're going to do reading, whatever it is. But having those kind of defined times for each activity and having them defined in a way that's clear to the class, what they're doing now, what they're doing next, and when that transition is going to happen. That can be really helpful, I think.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the feedback. I appreciate it.
Of course. Any other questions that people would like to chat about? Well, Dave and I will hang on for a minute if anyone has lingering questions or wants to chime in. But Erica, I don't know if you wanted to close us out at all, but I think we're good to
Yeah.
go and we really appreciate this time. But we'll be here if anyone wants to ask more questions in the chat or unmute yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll leave the Zoom meeting open a few minutes and see who wants to hang out. Thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Beth, Dave. What an incredibly thorough presentation. We're getting some great feedback in the chat about it. I will be emailing everyone who registered for this event a copy of this meeting, a recording, as well as the slides again. So grateful for everyone's commitment to increasing accessibility in your work. And yeah, I'm just really inspired by the work you're doing, Beth and Dave, and very grateful that you were able to share it with us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much to Erica and the Arts Council for making this happen today. You are such an invaluable resource to the community and to us individually. So thanks for having us.
Yep. All right, we'll stay on.
Thanks, everybody.
Crystal mentioned in the chat kind of having like a what to expect video and how cool those things can be. And a lot of folks that have like a marketing team or something like that, it can be a fairly easy thing to put together as long as you have someone that can do a little bit of video editing for you. I mean, we all have pretty high quality cameras in our pockets these days. So finding a way to stabilize that as much as possible and then, yeah, just walk through your space. Show people what it is so that when they walk in the door, it looks familiar instead of new and shocking. I wanted to underscore Crystal's comment. She's from the ballet and talked about their sensory friendly performances. They started them last season and she said that it's been a really positive experience. So that is really exciting to hear. And you know, I hope that I agree with her hope that that encourages people to give it a try. Thanks, y'all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We
Thank
really
you so
appreciate
much.
your time.
All right, we'll close out then. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.